Welcome to the HU Move Makers podcast, where we highlight folks that are blazing the trail and making moves in Howard culture. Welcome to the HU Move Maker podcast, where we highlight movers and shakers in Howard culture. Today we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Dana E. Crawford. This woman, pediatric and clinical psychologist, she developed the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training, CBRT, coming to a HR facility near you. Right now she's in Manhattan, graduate of Howard, Temple, Miami, degrees in African American Studies, psychology, certification in practical nursing, worked for the Department of Defense, and in 2020 she did over 55 trainings and presentations, so she's getting that bag. Currently a scholar at Columbia University. So this woman is smart. She's doing her thing, man. Dana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the honor of being in this HU beautiful space.
Man, absolutely. And it's such perfect timing that we would have you on the show, given everything that has happened this year with COVID. And, COVID really slowed things down and magnified a lot of things that were, I guess you could say, brushed under the rug in American society. And now it's kind of getting exposed. But then not only that, we have a new president-elect, and of course, Kamala Harris, who went to Howard University. The illustrious Howard University is a new vice president. So I want to talk to you about all of these things. I mean, I've read up on some of the studies that you've done. First, let's start with this. Tell me about the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first and foremost, there is a saying that research is me search. And so after my tenure at Howard University, I then decided to pursue my PhD. Well, in between that, I did a master's at Temple University, but then I decided to do my PhD at Miami University of Ohio, which is in the cornfields of Ohio, surrounded by cornfields and llama farms. And, really thinking about this year of the wave in a post-George Floyd, Breonna Taylor consciousness, right? So we know that historically we have bouts of increase in cultural consciousness as an American culture. And this year it happens to be George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. A few years ago it's Eric Gardner. A few years before that, Emmett Till, right? So there's always a wave of consciousness that occurs. And so when I applied to Miami University, I was coming off the wave of Hurricane Katrina and George Bush's second election. And so I think the white consciousness was awakened again. So, we should really care about Black, brown, tan, yellow people. And so the staff and the faculty at Miami University decided that they would admit a very diverse class. And so this idea of let's have more diversity, yet they hadn't done the inclusion work. And so as I was pursuing my PhD, I experienced all of these microaggressions from really lovely people that were very well-intentioned, were passionate, were compassionate, but yet were still racist, prejudiced, and biased. And so I started to become really curious about the phenomenon of how does racism, how does prejudice, how does bias show up in the therapy room? So I interviewed therapists all over the country and realized that the phenomenon that I discovered was called culture-based countertransference. Once I understood this phenomenon in which people project, therapists specifically, project their own bias onto their patient's experience, I wasn't okay with just knowing the phenomenon. I had to do something about it. Fast forward to 10 to 12 years later, and I've developed a bias reduction training. And so when I developed this theory and the training, a colleague said, what are you going to call it? I said, well, let's call it culture-based countertransference. And they were like, that's way too wordy. Nobody even knows say that sentence again 10 times fast. It's not accessible. And so I was like, maybe bias reduction. And they said, you should name the theory after yourself. And I was like, that's so narcissistic. And that colleague said, when men discover a theory or develop a theory, they name it after themselves. Women name theories after the content. it would be a revolutionary act for you to name your theory after yourself as a woman. And so I named it Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training. It's the concept of how racism, bias, and prejudice spreads, how we all become infected with bias and prejudice specifically, and some of us racism. And then it's also a treatment approach, really looking beyond psychologists, looking at all different fields in which you are in a service industry, that you are working with people, and the ways that our bias shows up as we're interacting with you.
Welcome to the Go Fish Village podcast. As a Chinese proverb says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. At Go Fish, our goal is to teach individuals just like you how to build wealth through real estate. So has this theory been how has it been accepted? You know, can you give me like the demographic of like what your colleagues look like? Because it has to be, you know, it would seem like, you know, you're kind of exposing a lot of things that, you know, quite frankly, people ignored. And I would imagine you work amongst a bunch of woke, you know, academics and people that study human behavior all the time. How was this received?
Yeah, it's so interesting because initially it was just a psychological theory. And I really approached it from the field of mental health and behavioral health. But from moving from different parts of the country and navigating my training as a pediatric psychologist and working in healthcare, people would say, well, this isn't just an issue for psychologists. It's an issue for oncologists. It's an issue for pediatricians. It's an issue for administrators. And so then I started navigating different spaces and people would say, well, it's not just in healthcare. It's in nonprofit. It's in government. It's in Congress. It's everywhere. And someone actually in one of the feedback said, I wish you could just follow me around in my life. And so the reality is this isn't just a situation that is happening just within the field of mental health. This is a human condition. It's a human theory. It's recognizing that we are all infected with a socially transmitted disease. And that's how bias and prejudice spreads. I think bias and prejudice is the other STD. And originally, most of my colleagues were mental health professionals. Now, honestly, I have done these trainings from academic Ivy League spaces to nonprofits to the middle school down the street to theater companies. Most recently, that was a new, beautiful experience, to state organizations, to people that are involved in legislation. And it's been received, you know, for the most part. People are very willing to be open. And part of that, I think, is because I don't advertise. I just show up where I'm invited. People hear about my theory through word of mouth. I estimate at this point about 20,000 people have been exposed to my approach, and that's not in recorded spaces. That's just face-to-face trainings over a number of years. I have no idea of all of the things that are in the public domain and how many people have watched that. But the beauty of not advertising, I go into a space with people already knowing that I'm going to say you are racist. You are biased, you are prejudiced, you are infected. If you're breathing, you're going to get some racism all up in your lungs. That's just what it is. So, you know, on first glance, people are really excited, especially in this current wave of consciousness. But once they start to get really deep and I ask them to look in the mirror of how they're infected, some people run away in fear. And then others are willing to engage and do that work. It really depends on the ego strength of the person to be able to look at the truth of who they are.
But do you have data that supports your theory?
Yeah, I have some pre-post data that looks at the ways that people perceive their experience of racism, prejudice, and bias. So one of the questions is, I feel very confident that none of my colleagues or patients perceive me as racist. Prior to my training, they feel extremely confident. And after my training, they lose that confidence, which is lovely because you shouldn't be that confident about things that you might not know. You should go in with some humility. Part of the work that I'm doing at Columbia University this year as a scholar in residence is taking the model to scale and examining the model, the CBRT model, in an organizational level. So I think I do a really great job of changing individual bias and prejudice. I think I do a pretty good job of changing interpersonal bias and prejudice. And I think I'm doing an okay job at changing organizational bias, prejudice, and racism. And so I have some process groups and some different methodology. And so this year is really about perfecting how to even measure it, because there's a measurement issue when you talk about organizational and systemic racism. And also, what is the best approach to reducing it?
What about the power structure within your field? I mean, have they taken a liking to? Have they accepted this as something that could be a standard in your field, or has it been rejected at all or
So
refuted?
yeah, definitely not rejected or refuted. I think there are a couple of different things that
Definitely not. Definitely not. I wish a nigga would.
try Jesus, don't try me. I think on one hand, some people invite this work into their organization because they want to feel good. They want to be
Hmm.
like, hey, we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. This
Right.
lady's
We
smart.
tried.
She's
We tried.
fun. She tries. She's nice. She has empathy.
Hmm.
And then when they get those edges snatched, and I read them, some organizations are like, yes, we want more. We actually are real. We're going to do this work. And then other organizations were like, we just want it to feel better. So it really just depends on the organization, how invested they are and how real they are about reducing and eliminating ultimately systemic, structural, and institutional racism. And so it's case by case. There's some groups that I can't believe they go in, they get retreats, they hire me for full day retreats and year-long consultations, and I have personal one-on-one meetings with their leadership. And then other ones invite me to these retreats, and it's hilarious. They'll be like, hey, we're doing our annual retreat. We're going to talk about bias, prejudice, and racism, CBRT in the morning, and then we're going to do painting with a twist in the afternoon. So, call us racist in the morning, and then we'll have a warm, fuzzy event in the afternoon. And so I like to think of myself as planting seeds. Some
Mm.
organizations want help growing trees, but I'm just planting seeds. And there have been times that organizations have reached out 1 year, and then 3 years later, they'll be like, hey, we're ready. We weren't ready like we thought we were, and now we're ready. And so it just kind of depends. It's a developmental process.
Crazy. I mean, you was basically preparing yourself for this 2020 COVID moment for a while now, and obviously, I'm sure it's been bearing fruit for you, which is always a beautiful thing. But what was, what's it like? I would imagine that when you get hired by, or when you do consulting or talk about your theory, and you go into these organizations that have been existing forever, and at least on their balance sheet, they're successful. What is it like to go into these rooms and you got to call people out on different things, and a lot of times probably the people in the room don't look like you, and can't
Yeah.
probably identify with where you came from, but you got the mic. Where do you get that type of confidence from, and then what is the response like in that moment?
Mm-hmm. Well, I get this confidence because it was given to me and taught to me at Howard University. That's some Howard confidence. That is from standing in rooms where people, it's not like black people to give you some confidence because your people will tell you like it is. And so if you can speak up and say your piece at Howard University, there are no rooms that one then doesn't have confidence. Howard,
Absolutely.
come on now. Um, while I was at Howard, I dabbled in the
I was in
of
some of them
spoken
rooms
word
with you
scene.
at Howard.
Right? We were in them same rooms. And so I had started this group called Poetry,
Hmm.
Extraordinary Poetry, when I was
I
at
remember
Howard. And I
that.
would do,
I remember
and I
that.
would
I
do
remember that.
spoken word. And I remember I was at Crampton and I had done this spoken word event and I was garbage, right? And so people was not, nobody was impressed. It was just like, mm-hmm. And so I was humiliated. It challenged me, and I practiced, and I got better because the standard of excellence at Howard is very, very high. It's the
Mm.
moon, and some people are just reaching for wherever their elevator goes in their building. But at Howard, it's like, ain't nobody impressed with your little elevator for. You're going to have to go all the way to the moon, and then how you get into Mars. Like, nobody cares. You have to be excellent. And so I think that piece of it really helped me, but there are times that it is scary. When we talk about white supremacy or white toxicity, or as one of my dear friends calls white savagery, these spaces of intimidation, of oppression, sometimes it's scary. There have been times that older white men with power have said things that were sexist and racist and, attempted to bully me. The thing about Howard is it teaches you to have that stone face, but when you get off that Zoom, sometimes there are tears. Sometimes it's painful to do this human work. Racism is a barrier to people's humanity, and when people shut off their humanity, the things that they will do to another human, it can be devastating. Um, So I think, most days it's fine because people are willing to be kind, but in other days, sometimes it's hard. And that's when I lean into my Howard brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings to get that support.
So what and that's real what you're saying. I mean, that's a tough position to be in because you're basically you go to school to get this education. You're studying theories and models that for since the founding of your field have probably been all by white men, and just up until maybe recently, women have been more accepted, and those ideas have been more accepted. What was the aha moment that you said? Because I know you said in the classroom you said it showed up.
Mhm.
Tell me about the aha moment for you when you were like, man, this is some BS.
Yeah, to be real, when I was at Howard, I first started out. I went to high school for 2 years, and then I went to nursing school my last 2 years of high school with the goal of becoming a medical doctor. So I worked at nursing homes on my winter breaks and on the weekends when I didn't have track meets because I ran track at Howard. Shout out to track license. And during that process, when I started thinking about racism, when I was looking at psychology books, a lot of times those books would, or even in African American studies, the images of racism that I thought about were like those black and white pictures of somebody, a dog attacking a black person or somebody pouring milkshakes on somebody, and I learned a little bit about the subtle ways that racism shows up through the ISIS papers, but I hadn't really lived it. I didn't know white people like I do now. There's an old Southern saying, know your white. I didn't know my white when I went into this experience. I didn't know how well-intentioned liberal people can still be racist, how someone I could have dinner at their house where their mother is white and their father is black and they could still be racist. Like, I didn't understand those nuances of interpersonal racism. And so around that time that I started at Miami, there was a really amazing article by Dr. D.W. Sue, Daryl Sue, that came out called Racial Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And he really popularized the term that was developed by Dr. Chester Pierce, a black psychiatrist, of microaggressions, these subtle, everyday slights, indignities that occur to black people. And when I read that article, I was like, this is what I'm experiencing. It's not malicious, but it's still painful. There's a saying, microaggression, but macro impact, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so that aha moment was, wow, you can be a good person and still be racist. You could be a good person and still be queer phobic. You could be a good person and still be sexist. These aren't concepts that have to do with your moral character. They have to do with your wiring and how your brain is perceiving other and defining people as other and how you connect to resources and fear. And so once I understood that phenomenon, I was able to step into empathy and then also be able to call it out like, oh, yo, what's up, racism? Hey, yeah, I didn't know you was coming to my house this weekend, and it became something that I could say. I know some lovely racists. Some of my best friends are infected with racism, and some of my dearest friends are infected with bias and prejudice. And we
Man.
still can be friends, but you're still infected.
So I mean, are these like are you having these conversations with people that I heard you say some of my friends. I mean, are you like I would be offended if somebody said some of these things to me and they considered me a friend and I didn't agree with it. I would be offended by that. Are you telling them that? And if you
Yeah.
are, like, when is a good time to tell someone that? Because I would be offended, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think people become offended if they're thinking of racism as one type, one. And I think, two, they become offended if they think it's a comment on your moral character. Like if somebody was to say, like, hey, you got a stain on your shirt. If I had a stain on my shirt, I wouldn't be offended. That doesn't have to do with me as a moral person. I'm like, thank you for pointing that out. That's, to me, that's how racism, prejudice, and bias is. It is a programming that humans do. We know that race is a made up concept. It's a social construct that has real biological, economic, financial, spiritual ramifications. And so we recognize it as a human phenomenon of the way that we're thinking that all humans are infected with some type of bias and prejudice, in this country also racism, depending on the power access you have, then what is there to be offended about? And so when I think about, racism that might be offensive to someone is if they're thinking only about individual racism. So individual or personal racism has to do with the way that you think of the world. So if you're not walking around like, I'm better than this person because they're black and I'm white, and I say, hey, you're racist, of course you're going to be offended. Like, absolutely not. I don't think like that. That's disgusting. But then there's interpersonal racism, and that has to do, or interpersonal bias. That has to do with the things that you've been exposed to. I personally don't know a lot of people from Yemen. Now, if somebody from Yemen moved next door and I'm talking to them, it's highly likely that due to my lack of experiences, I might say something offensive related to their culture because I don't know anything about that. What am I to be offended by? Because I haven't been educated. I don't know about that thing. And I may say a microaggression to them, or they might say something to me. And then when we think about organizational or systemic or structural racism, it's important that we recognize that people are institutions. So white people like to think of institutional racism as like this boogeyman over here. We need to stop institutional racism. No, you institutional racism. If you want to stop institutional racism, that starts with your family, your circle of friends. That starts with the community your kids go to school. All of that is institutional racism. And that system was not created with me and mine in mind. And that's just the truth of the matter. And so as a friend, one of the most loving things that I could ever say to a white person is to let them know about the ways that they're blocking their humanity through racism, prejudice, and bias. That's an act of love to tell somebody that. People pay me to tell them that. I'm giving you that love for free.
Wow. That's real talk. Damn. So, I mean, for this to be existing for so long, and for you to be the one that not necessarily discovered it, but you took the time to say, hey, I noticed what's going on, and I'm about to give it a name and a theory. I mean, what does that say about therapy as a whole? For it to be 20, I don't know when you came up with the theory, but for this to be the 21st century and it's finally got a name, and only 20,000 people have been exposed to it.
Yeah, I would dare say that I'm not the first by any means to come up with a theory and a concept and a theory. But I do think oftentimes people miss both, so they may have a theory and then they talk a lot about awareness. And so, the first wave and the shoulders that I stand on is the first waves of diversity, equity, and inclusion. A few years ago, multiculturalism, cultural competency, cultural humility, whatever term you want to use at a hot moment of whatever book you're reading, anti-racism. The shoulders that I stand on are the shoulders of awareness. And so many scholars are writing about different understandings and microaggressions, micro-assaults, micro-invalidations that show up. But it's the leap between awareness to then getting to concrete action steps. So my model specifically talks about the awareness. How did you become infected with the socially transmitted disease? That is bias, prejudice, and racism. And I walk people through genograms where they trace their history and learn who taught you how to be biased. Where did you learn it? Where did you catch it? A lot of theorists, regardless of if it's sexism or queerphobia or homophobia or ableism, they stop there. The next piece of my model is investigation. And originally I called this identification, but investigation seems a lot more active. And identification is finite, yet you point at it, it's done. Investigation is, it's under investigation, and you're specifically identifying and investigating what triggers your racism, prejudice, and bias. What activates that STD for you? And how do you respond? How does it manifest for you? So do you cry? Do you get defensive? Do you get angry? Do you try and superhero and go into white savior mode? Do you focus on all the ways that you're not biased and you talk about other groups and you just detract and you kind of, divert the attention? And then the last piece is how do you reduce the impact on an individual, interpersonal, and organizational racism, targeting each type, not just one area. And so someone may have done amazing work to reduce their individual bias, but they're still engaging in interpersonal microaggressions and they're still working for systems of oppression. And so it's never completed work, and that's why it's called reduction, not elimination, because it's a human condition.
Man, that's tough, man. That's tough to hear. I mean, have you and to your credit, I mean, you say that everybody has a bias, not just this is not a thing that's infecting white people. Everybody indeed has a bias, so we all have work that we need to do. But I'm curious to ask. I mean, would you consider yourself to be a religious person?
No, I consider myself to be a spiritual person who identifies with the rituals of Christianity because that's what I was raised in. So when I have a hard time and I need some comfort, I'm gonna go to a Bible because that's what I know. But I live my life as a spiritual being.
How has your work impacted your religion? Because I would, when we think about, when we get older, of course, when we're kids, it's like, okay, believe in God, believe in Jesus. So whatever your parents are, that's pretty much what you're gonna do. But as we get older, we see stuff about how religion was used to control slaves, and then we learn about white supremacy, and then you get deeper, like you go to undergrad, the master level. Now you get in the PhD, and you probably reading all this stuff like, yo, this is crazy. How has your studies, affected your religion?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think for me, recognizing what the utility of a religion is. And so many people use religion in many different ways, just like people can use a butter knife to put butter on bread, or they can use it as a tool to put their IKEA furniture together, right? So whatever way you want to use it. And so I think of religion in the same way. For me, religion is about being able to identify my humanity. And I know that every day, racism, prejudice, and bias is coming for my humanity. It will take my soul away in the sense of I will not be able to look at another human and have empathy if I allow racism to plant its seed in me a certain way. The same for bias, the same for prejudice. And so religion helps me stay soft so I don't become hard and I'm not able to connect to humans. But I also recognize systems, regardless of if that's religion, if that's certain types of parenting and we get into attachment theory, that every major system can use its doctrine to mentally enslave another group. And religion is just one of those that has been used for centuries to oppress and to colonize the Black mind. And so I'm
Mm.
always, on the lookout for the sophisticated way that racism, prejudice, and bias likes to play out. It morphs, it changes, and that's why you have to be vigilant because this thing can change one day. It could be, I think about 9/11 pre and post. So people weren't even, maybe a few people, but for the most part, people weren't even thinking about Muslims. And then all of a sudden, people are like Islamophobia, Islamophobia. Like, I'm afraid of this because it morphs, because it's specifically correlated with resources and fear. So resources, will I have access to the things that I value? And if I am worried about those resources, then I develop a fear. And so you can always be worried about resources. There's no finite amount of resources, and fear is always available. And so therefore, bias and prejudice and racism will continue to be able to morph in different ways. That's why it requires a systematic approach.
So for the layman, and I feel like what you're saying can be applied to even just relationships like with me and my wife, or me and my kids, or me and my staff here at, just period. I mean, how can I actively reduce levels of bias? But at the same time, I feel like, okay, on a certain level, you got to be like street smart. You know what I mean? You can't
Of
just be
course.
like
Yeah.
totally accepting of, oh, because on one end, you do have the stereotype because you got to be street smart. But at the same time, you don't want that stereotype to spill over and now you negatively impacting somebody's life. How can I actively reduce my biases that I may have?
Yeah, so the very first part is recognizing who you are as a multicultural individual. So everybody is multicultural. You are a man, you're Black, you are a father, you're a professional, you are able bodied, you are verbal. I imagine you have some religious context. I hear that I've always been a man that I know, so you're a cis man. You bring all of these identities, and also you're a HU graduate, right? And so carrying all
Absolutely.
of those identities with you, they intersect, and depending on what room you're in, they become more amplified or they're silent. They're just not as relevant. So the first piece is understanding that relationship, that's the looking in the mirror piece. It's understanding, like, who are you when you walk in a room? So when you walk in a room, it's not just Josh, it's you and the crew of your multicultural identities. You and your crew walk into every single space. Culture is a silent participant in every single interaction. So in thinking about how you're going to reduce your bias, the first comes with that awareness. You got to know who you are, your history, and who you're bringing in. The next piece is you need to understand what triggers your bias. So I am a Black cis woman, first generation college student. As a first generation college student, when I'm sitting in a room with people who are fourth generation college students, I already know that that's a bias. Like I can already be triggered because I'm thinking, like, am I good enough? Am I not? I have some internalized low self-esteem, imposter syndrome that could potentially be activated. I already knew that walking into that room. So then when I walk into that room and that happens, then I already have insight, right? And I already know myself well enough to know how it manifests. So when I feel imposter syndrome, I tend to overcompensate and overtalk. I already know that about me. And so when I see that happening, I'm now the observer. I'm not in my emotional mind. My mind's not full of all that imposter syndrome stuff. I'm watching it like, yo, what's up? Internalized racism. There you are. Internalized classism. There you are. And so then the last piece is being able to reduce it. So I might have to do some deep breathing. I might have to do some journaling. I might have to do some transparency and talk with a friend about it. I might have to just observe that, tuck that in my pocket, and just be in that moment. And then when I get home, I'm going to have to do some self-work on it. But it's that process of that awareness, that investigation, and that reduction that helps bring a structure to a system that can have your mind so full that you're just like, what? I don't even know what's going on. And you're not even able to access your mindful self because your mind is so full.
Man, that's some deep stuff. I see why they pay you the big bucks. I see why they pay you the big bucks, man. So, okay, so you mentioned one thing about imposter syndrome, and even you said you're a first generation college graduate, and but you've achieved all these things: master's degree, PhD. You're Dr. Crawford. How is it that somebody can achieve all these things, have a theory, be married, have kids, the whole 9 yards? You'd be regarded in this amazing light. You're at this. You're at Columbia, and you enter a room, and you still have imposter syndrome. What? How is that? And I ask
Yeah.
because I have people on the show and amazing guests that I would never imagine were intimidated when they were in certain settings. I can see it when you're 18, but not when you're 40, because you got a track record.
Yeah. That's the power of systemic, organizational, institutional bias, prejudice, and racism. It's the psychology of why representation matters. There are spaces of all the things that you can create as an individual that if your whole people aren't with you and you walk into that room, the question of, do I belong here? If I'm the only one that looks like me, that speaks like me, that has the values that I have, is this the room that I'm supposed to be in? And that imposter syndrome makes you ask that question, because even if you're a standout, until we all are there, it makes us question, should one be there? And I think, the other part for me with the imposter syndrome has to do with this push in this country for diversity, but not having inclusion work. And so a lot of people, a lot of organizations, are interested in diversity numbers, checking the boxes, Black people, Indigenous people, LGBTQIA people, but yet don't plant the seed and grow the trees of making the space inclusive. So prime example, when I hear organizations say, how can we, when they hire me, how can we have more diversity in our organization? And I say, did you Google that question before you asked me? And they're like, oh no, okay, well, did you Google a recipe for dinner last night? Yeah, I did. Did you Google what school your child should go to? Yeah, I Googled that. Did you Google a lot of things in your life? If you valued this, you would spend the time educating yourself about this. So instead of just inviting someone into a space that you have done no work in, it's sort of like I invite you to my house, but I didn't clean up first. Inclusion is about preparing the space so people can be comfortable when they get there. And the imposter syndrome thrives in spaces that are diversity driven without inclusion work.
Damn. That's weird because when I got to well, that's right on. I you know I just heard about imposter syndrome this year from I think I don't know if, I think it was Halima Nash that was on, and she was
Mm.
talking to me about it. That was really the first time. And then and she talked about it when she got to Howard. She said
Mm.
that when she stepped on Howard's campus, seeing, of course we got beautiful women, everybody was the prettiest girl in there, high school, or the smartest, or from this family or that family. And
And
then you
Halima
get
is like drop dead gorgeous. At that. Like, what? As a
yeah.
pretty girl, I'm like, what? Halima is 16 years old gorgeous. I wish I was as beautiful as Halima. Anyway, continue.
No, exactly. And that was my first time hearing that. And she was saying that she had it as a freshman at Howard. So these are things that it's not just a I'm the only black person in the room type of thing. You can be amongst people that look like you, and still experience this, which I found interesting. When I went to Howard, it was really, I had, my own stereotypes and sense of worth, but it really wasn't until I got to Howard that I was able to undo stereotypes about myself. You know what I'm saying? Or about black people, period. Because I was used to being, okay, the one black kid in every single class that I was in. So I was like, oh, I'm about to go to Howard. I'm about to kill. It's about to be easy. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't got nothing to worry about. It was the total opposite. And it's weird because Howard was, for me, that was the most diverse setting that I've ever been in. You know, and people may not understand that because it's a black college, but for me, it was definitely the most diverse setting that I'd ever been in. In my life, and I'm forever grateful for that. That's how I met you.
Yeah, yeah. I think, when we talk about imposter syndrome, it lends itself to the reflection that we are not just one identity. We know that Black people are extremely diverse, but specifically, there were times that I had imposter syndrome at Howard. It flares up at different points because I am a survivor of humanity psychologically oppressing many parts of my identity. So, parts of my identity being a woman, being Black, related to class, and pretty privileged. We know for the reality of this country that certain people, we know that pretty people make more money. We know that it's based on your height. For every inch you're above average height, you make about $1,000 more per year.
Damn,
I
that's
say
why
that
I'm broke. That's why I'm broke.
so like these privileges, these identity points are not just based on race. And I think that's also one of the things that I stand on the shoulders of diversity work is that we often don't get to reflect on the intra-cultural ways that bias and prejudice show up because it's so focused on the white experience and centering whiteness. One of my favorite spaces to talk are in Black spaces to talk about all of the different ways that bias and prejudice show up for us and for the people within our community who have the ability to be racist due to the power that they have access to. Everybody don't have that access. Everybody don't have the power to be racist. And some people seeking that power, and that has to do with the ways that Black people don't show up for each other. But that might be a whole nother lecture.
Mm.
But I think that it's crucial that we recognize the ways that even within our own community, prejudice and bias can still show up. It's still coming for us. You never know when it's gonna come through.
So I was reading something, and it was a study that Citibank, I think, had did, and they said that the U.S. economy lost $16 trillion because of discrimination, and that was just in 2020. So of course, like I talked about earlier, COVID has exposed so many different things, and I feel like a study like that will come out, and now we see these new positions that are popping up: diversity and inclusion, or chief of equity, and it like when you go around, do you see, for the most part, is it just lip service? Is it just like a budget? Okay, we're gonna budget X for this speaker to come in, but we're not really gonna implement anything that they say do, or do you, or are you noticing a drastic shift from when you first started doing your work until now?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I have been in this work for over 10 years. And so I have a couple of organizations now that I've worked with for a number of years. And some of them first hired me just to do one presentation. And then I was, at some point, I was the director of the Trauma Informed Care Program at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Montefiore Medical Center. And so I was really exploring the intersection of my model and trauma. And so in doing that work, I got to know a lot of different people and became a national expert and traveled around. And so over these years, I've gotten to see, like, okay, is this organization serious? Are they not? You know, sometimes they'll ask a little question on an email and then they don't follow up. Sometimes they want to do a whole hour-long consultation and then they don't follow up. Then others, they just send an email and they say you're hired. They don't even want to have a conversation about it. Those are always red flags. But then George Floyd and Breonna Taylor happened. And then it was interesting because I already had some relationships with folks. And so they already had known a little bit about me. And there's one organization, a lot of them have non-disclosure agreements because they don't want everybody to know they're racist and biased and prejudiced. So I can't say the organization, but this organization I've worked with for a number of years. And they knew all my work. They have recorded it. I've done 8-hour trainings with them. They flew me all around the country for different retreats. I've been going to cities, my family enjoying it. We getting fly apartment, hotel rentals. And what they contacted me about this time is that they just wanted help to have a conversation and to help stop being biased. And so initially I did the conversation and the feedback was like, this was great. Help me get deeper into the inspection. We want to stop. We want to do some real serious work. And I read them like I never did before in a way that, you know, you talk about that fear earlier. I was scared. I was like, I'm about to say this to these white people.
Wow.
And it was amazing. And they sat there and took that thing and leaned into it and reflected. And next week we're doing another retreat. And they're putting their time. So they're giving their staff permission to not just go to this meeting and then go to another, but their actual money with their values. And that was remarkable. I couldn't believe it. And then there are other organizations. This is school I just worked with. And I said, I have some concerns. You can't just do this cultural training. All your staff white, all the kids are brown, black, tan, a few yellow kids. What are you going to do? And they were like, we'll just have your training. That's all we're going to do. And so in the training, I read them and I was honest. I said, hey, this is the concept. Your organization is interested in targeting individual and interpersonal racism, but I can come present every week. And until your organization is ready to do organizational change, like collaborating with HR, changing of policies, going through your website and asking the question, how can it be anti-racist, line by line, really planning on pipelines. How do you create diversity at the executive level, not middle management? Until they do that work, we can talk all day and your staff will feel like you did something. But I promise you, in a few years, your retention will not change. Your staff will not be healthier, and you will continue to see the same problems you have today. And so it just kind of depends on the organization.
So in your work, you have to have an understanding of how what you say will affect the bottom line of these companies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a language that everybody understands is money.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you another question. So I was also reading, or I was on Facebook, you know, just going through stories and whatnot, and I saw it was a gentleman on there that said hip hop is responsible for a lot of trauma in the black community. What are your thoughts when I say something like that?
I think one, hip hop is responsible for a lot of the resiliency of the black community. And so I think sometimes we can get so fixated on all the things that have been wrong. We talk about generational trauma and epigenetics and how we inherit trauma and how our bodies change because of trauma. But we also don't point out that resiliency is also inherited in the epigenetics of resiliency. So I just want to point out that piece. But, you know, hip hop and rap, you can differentiate there, is not owned mostly by black people anymore. You know, the largest consumer of hip hop is white men. And so when we talk about responsible for the trauma, what gets funded has to be always the question in the back of your head. Like, it can't ever be like, okay, these are the words. Who decided that those words would get on that radio station? Who decided whose voice would be amplified? And so we can't ever separate racism from capitalism. and who has the money. And so I do think that there are aspects of all music that is traumatizing for people. There is no music that is trauma free. And that is true for hip hop, just as the same is true for rock and roll. You know, it's true for many genres of music. And so let's not zoom in on Black people and target the ways that we are doing wrong. I just don't find that to be particularly beneficial. I think we should be leaning more into resiliency messages and asking the question, how can hip hop heal? And what are the elements of hip hop that are healing, and how do we amplify those components?
Mm. Donald Trump, he pushed to expand anti-racism training to federal contractors. So he was trying to, I don't know, were you aware of
Eliminate
that?
it. Yeah, that Donald Trump had said that he was going to eliminate that any racism training. He found it to be toxic, that racism trainings actually perpetuate racism, and that any funding, any organization that was mandating bias, prejudice, and racism training would lose funding. So
Any
yeah,
any any truth any truth to that? Was he on to something?
so
Any
it's
truth to that?
interesting. You know, it's similar to in the field of psychology, people who are very early in their fields and in their training might think that asking someone about suicide will make them want to kill themselves. Like if I ask you, do you want to kill yourself? Then somebody's gonna be like, hey, I kill myself, right? And we know that that's a myth. Like the notion, if you were thinking about killing yourself, you were going to do that. By the way, if you are thinking of killing yourself, please text 741-741. It's a crisis text line. You don't even have to talk to anybody. You can just text the word hi. But, you know, talking about race, does it cause racism? The notion of color blindness, that was really the movement of the psyche of the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, that people should not see race as a racist thing. Like if you see race, that makes you racist. It's a myth. Like, you know, you Black, I know I'm Black. You saying I'm Black doesn't make me be like, oh my God, you're racist. Like, it's seeing what is the truth. And so there is research that shows that mandating racism, prejudice, and bias trainings don't work. You know, so if I make you come, that doesn't necessarily change your thinking. But if it's an organizational value and you say, these are all the ways that we are going to, as leadership, demonstrate anti-racist philosophy, and if you are part of this organization's belief system, you will attend this. And here is how leadership is being an example. Then you see change. But if you just have your staff go to a training and it's mandated and you're not willing to do organizational work, then it does breed animosity and makes people feel like it's lip service. It's all the things that you talked about. So when an organization is just like throw some money at it and they don't want to do any work, then I don't think that's helpful. I think it can be very painful for people who are really invested in this work and want to change and want to reduce their racism, prejudice, and bias.
Wow.
But
As
don't
a
stop
black,
the funding because, you know, sister got private school to pay for.
that's real talk. So as a black man, a woman, or whoever, someone with children, what should I be telling my children about racism, and you know, should those conversations be, you know, ongoing, or like what should I be? Because if you're on social media, it would make you to believe that it's life and death. You know what I'm saying? But we know that of course it is life and death, but you have to know how to maneuver. You know what I'm saying? You have to
Right.
know how to deal with folks. Because you got the covert racism, you know, that folks have to deal with at a certain level, but then you have the other racism that, you know, when they're just out here killing people. As someone with children, I mean, how do you break this down to your children?
Yeah, so my daughter is 4 years old. My son will be two next month. So, of course, I don't know if you've heard of the doll study, where the classic Clark
Well,
doll
yeah,
study, where you ask the child, is this the good doll, is this the bad
I did
doll?
that with my
I'm a
son.
right. I'm a psychologist, and I went to Howard. Of course, I was doing that tested too. Like, who the good doll? The black one is the best. You know, like, of course, I'm trying to
Yeah,
instill a sense of pride because I'm trying to counter the world that my child lives in that doesn't tell her that she's beautiful in every step that she walks in. Right. But as kids get older, what I really invite parents to lean into, and not just Black parents, like Black people did not cause racism. So we alone cannot undo it. If we could have, we would have done that 500 years ago. White people have to do some white people work. This is white people work to do. Just like men have to stop being sexist. Just like heterosexual people have to stop being queerphobic. Like the people with the power, the people with the majority identity and the dominant identity have to stop oppressing, regardless of what that is. So if I have a doctorate, I cannot believe that my Ivy League education is better than community knowledge. You know, like these are all things that those of privilege have to reduce.
So we got to start
But
shaming Hampton. We can't keep shaming Hampton like that,
well,
right?
I prefer to just ignore them. No, just silence. So shout out to all HBCUs, and the Mecca is the best. And so, you know, what I invite parents, Black, white, and all parents, is to talk about bullying. That's already language that children have. And so racism is a type of bullying because of the body, the skin that somebody lives in. Sexism is a type of bullying because somebody is a boy or a girl. You know, and so you start to, as kids get older, you can get very nuanced in the type of bullying that is anchored in bias, prejudice, and racism. But when they're at a young age, you just name it bullying. Because it is. It's just plain old bullying at 4, 5, 6, 7. That's just bullying. And so one of the important things is just like you would teach your child stranger danger and you would teach them safety about that, I teach my children safety about all things. And one of those is oppression and racism. Like some people get bullied because of the skin they live in. Isn't that terrible? So one of my favorite examples of a story I had with my little one, my daughter who's 4, she was really into that TV show, Ni Hao Kai Lan, which is about this sweet little Chinese girl who has like this little black ponytails, and she's like ni hao in every episode, and it's very lovely. And my daughter loves the show. And so one day she was like, I want hair, like ni hao kai lan. And I was like, what kind of hair is that? She was like, I want China hair. And I was like, what? She was like, I want Chinese people hair. And I said, well, her hair is called black. It's not China people hair. She has black hair. You want black hair. And she was like, yes, I want black hair. So even correcting that language, and she was like, well, it's Chinese hair. And I said, no, if, you know, Ni Hao Kai Lan was here, that's not a nice way to describe somebody's hair. We describe hair like that as black. So I'm getting very concrete. I'm explaining. And then I said, that might hurt her feelings. And you wouldn't want to bully her in that way. We're not bullies in this family, are we? And she was like, no, we're not bullies. I said, so if you're not a bully and you wouldn't want to hurt someone, this is the language you use. And that is what we expect in this family. That is our expectation. And this is what I'm going to teach you. And then after, I was like, but you ain't going to have no hair like that because that's not the hair you got. So also look in the mirror and say you're beautiful because you ain't got no Ni Hao Kai Lan hair. It's possible, you know?
That's real. Is privilege, is that good or bad to have privilege?
It is what it is. You know, I wish everybody could have privilege. I like my privilege. I'm not trying to get rid of my privilege. I like it. It works for me. You know, privilege, my favorite definition is privilege doesn't mean you're a bad person. Privilege doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard. It just means that your skin color, your gender, your education, your class aren't the things making your life harder, right? And so, you know, I lean towards equity. I think everyone should be striving for equity, and equity is really about everyone gets what they need. So equality is like everyone gets the same thing. So if we're thinking about equality, it's that everybody gets a pair of pants. Everybody's going to get some beige khaki pants with a 32 inseam. That's just what you're going to get. Regardless of, you know, your weight, maybe you can't wear that size. Regardless of your height, maybe they're too short, maybe they're too long. Regardless of your religion, maybe you don't even wear pants, you wear a hijab. Regardless of if you're able-bodied, maybe you don't even have legs and you're a veteran, right? So equality is like, so what? You still get khaki pants. Maybe you live in Alaska and that's not warm enough, or you live somewhere super hot and pants are inappropriate. Equality is everyone gets clothing based on what they need. And that idea that, you know, how do we do the most efficient thing for the maximum outcome related to resources? And so those spaces, I think, are more efficient and more helpful than us thinking about equality or even privilege. Privilege is just a way for you to know that lens that we talked about earlier related to your awareness. Knowing your privilege is going to help you be more of a bias reductionist.
Is it possible to be like is it obviously, you know, let's say for example, I got a daughter, I got a son. I want my daughter to marry a black man. You know, is it wrong for me to feel that way? Like when does it become wrong?
Yeah, so I think it becomes wrong when you don't allow your daughter to be herself in the world. We all have dreams for our kids. I will be heartbroken, and I even fear to say this for maybe it be spoken in the universe. I would be heartbroken if my children ever were to tell me they didn't want to go to Howard University, right? That would be a very sad day in my life on some real. Like, how could they betray all the love I've given? I
Right.
grew you humans. You know how many times I woke up late and you would ever, like, I can't imagine. But if they ever betrayed my love in that way, I would have to accept that. And I would love them and I would work through it and I would talk to my therapist about it. Because as much as we would like to own our children, they are their own people. And we don't get to own them. We
Mm.
are ushers of someone else's journey in this life. We are privileged that we get to have that time with them. But for the most part, you come in this world alone and you leave it alone.
Hmm. So what I'm hearing is you could agree to disagree, basically. That's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as long as you're creating a space for dialogue,
Hmm.
like I definitely want my children to marry someone that looks like me and my husband, because those are our values and that's what we believe. But most importantly, I want my children to be kind in this world. I want my children to be in a relationship where they feel seen and that they can be a good citizen in this world. I want them to feel validated and safe. I hope that would happen with someone that looks like me. But if it doesn't and they found it in someone, then that's the most important thing to me.
Because sometimes, I ask that question because, if let's say if I have a problem with somebody, not necessarily a problem, but I don't agree with homosexuality. Now you get branded as, oh, you're homophobic, and it's like you lose your voice. You're like, you
Cancel.
you said this thing because right, you get canceled without really being like, I guess, treated, without going and getting the Crawford bias reduction theory and training. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I remember I posted something on social media. It was about I said something like, about Black Lives Matter. Should they help curb violence in the black community? And it was an honest question, but people wasn't feeling it obviously because that's not their mission. I remember I posted something else about we have a guy that went to Howard and he's the highest ranking staffer in Donald Trump's campaign. So I posted it, not saying that I agree with it, but just, I post stuff about Kamala, but for some people it got really, really, it triggered emotions. I basically just copied and pasted or screenshotted something from the Washington Post, and I was like, I posted on the Howard alumni Instagram account, and man, it was like, dang, are we moving towards a society where if I feel a way about something, I got to be so conscious of offending people that I can't even express myself. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Yeah, I think that feeling of restriction is a really hard one to experience. That you can't express yourself. This is the land of free speech. But I also think it's really critical that we recognize the power of where speech happens. And so if I want to express myself and I'm really trying to connect, where am I doing that? Social media is a place for validation of one's own perspective for most people. People follow the things that they believe in. They follow the people they believe in. They like the stories and the pictures that reflect themselves. It's a mirror space. It's a space of looking in the mirror. Often people want to believe it's a space of looking out the window of someone else's journey. It's not. It's not. And so most people are not going to have beautiful cross-cultural exchanges through social media. And so one has to be very conscious of what the purpose of the space is. For me, I use social media as a learning tool. I specifically follow voices that I don't have access to in my daily life. I want to hear the stories of indigenous people that are queer. I don't know indigenous queer people. They ain't walking around Harlem. So how else do I have access to that story rather besides social media? Other people use social media just to keep up with their friends from high school they ain't even like, or their friends from Howard that they ain't even kick it with. And so, like, what is the purpose? What are you doing? How are you using your energy in the world? Always has to be asked. And I don't find that many people are looking for an intellectual discourse, a heart change, a spiritual connection, and a space of humility in social media. People are just not that engaged. It's clickbait and they move on with their lives. And so I think when we start to feel like our voices aren't heard, it's because you're not speaking in a space where your voice was meant to be heard. That's not what social media is for. It's a curated identity.
Hmm. How do you deal with stress? I would imagine that you are always dealing with other folks' problems, not just from work, but your kids, your spouse, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how do you deal with stress? And not just
Yeah.
that, you know, it's weird because you get to this space where, your whole life you're like, okay, I'm gonna I want to be Dr. Crawford one day, right? And then you finally become Dr. Crawford. You're doing this amazing things, and now there's a pressure with maintaining Dr. Mom, entrepreneur, all of that stuff. How do you deal with all of that stuff?
Well, it's interesting because prior to COVID, I used to travel. I did a lot of speaking events. So at least twice a month, I got to stay in a really nice hotel without my kids and my husband. So that was awesome. I would get a little massage, swim in a little pool, get some room service, and I had just cracked that point where people were flying me occasionally first class. That joint was lovely. And now I'm home with these people
With the peasants.
24/7 with my children, these little Gila monsters who are relentless. I go to sleep, they there. I wake up, they there. I go to the bathroom, they in the bathroom. Having young kids and pandemic parenting is no joke. Sometimes I think I do a really good job of handling stress. I stretch, I drink water, I eat green things, I juice cleanse, I practice with my friends, I go to therapy. And then other days I don't do so great. I'm irritable. I might snap at a loved one. I might, not have the patience that I wish I had. It's day by day. This COVID life is hard. And sometimes, the space of holding, ushering white consciousness and supporting Black healing, some days it's harder than others. I think the last week has been really hard. And so it really just depends. I try to exercise. I try and have great sex with my husband. I try and, take long showers and pray and meditate and have time with friends virtually now. But it just kind of depends. I don't
Mm.
think anybody does it perfectly. This stuff is hard. To be
So
honest.
tell me about and that's good stuff. I mean, those are, and these are all things that, from what I'm hearing, you got to be intentional about these things. You can't just imagine that it happens. You really got to be intentional, and that's one thing that me and my wife are learning. As you get older, when you're younger, me personally, I didn't have a ton of stress to deal with when I was in college. It really didn't settle in until I was an entrepreneur, and then after that, when I was responsible for like kids, it was like, damn, okay, I gotta really handle my business for them and for me, because you're basically, in charge of everything with them. So I 100%, agree with what you said. Welcome to the Go Fish Village podcast. As a Chinese proverb says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. At Go Fish, our goal is to teach individuals just like you how to build wealth through real estate. Now, I know you have, expertise when it comes to pediatric. Tell me about like your typical client that you'll see when it comes to a one-on-one.
Yeah, so most recently that changed for me. Prior to August, I used to work in the South Bronx in this pediatric clinic, in a family medicine, social pediatric clinic, where a pediatrician will refer a patient of theirs to come see me because there was a behavioral issue, there was a psychological issue that was interfering with their optimal health. And that might be ADHD, that might be sickle cell, that might be cancer, that might be attention issues, oppositional issues, it might be the death of a loved one, grief, dying, the whole nine. Because of COVID and the ways that the healthcare system did not honor what I needed to do for my own family, because I say words, so I wasn't really trying to go into a hospital. Many people on my team actually got COVID. Some people from my clinic actually died from COVID. And so I was not willing to physically go into the office any longer in the ways that the healthcare system was demanding that of my Black body, that it was higher at risk for COVID than other bodies. And so I stopped working there. And so part of the role of Columbia, now I'm specifically doing research and interventions related to CBRT, but I still have my private practice. So a typical private practice day right now, I'm seeing primarily adult patients, some of them with children, so helping them navigate pandemic parenting. My private practice is primarily on Sundays, and then a few patients during the week. And so a typical day looks like a Black woman coming in, usually highly successful. I see mostly very privileged, successful Black women who are like CFOs, CEOs of the company, and the only Black person is dealing with all that race stress. And we do a variety of things. We focus on how to have a value-driven life instead of emotion-driven. And so our emotions come and go in ocean waves. So if you feel sad and you like, I'm just going to lay in bed, and you base your life on how you feel, you're never going to have the outcomes you want in life. You have to make your decisions based on your values. So it's really about helping people.
So what's like an example of a value-driven life?
So prime example, I ran track, I value having a six pack. But I also am tired some days, right? And so when my alarm goes off at 6 o'clock and I'm tired, my emotion driven decision is, girl, you know how hard you work. You got 3 jobs, 2 kids, a Black husband, a dog, and a Black mama, and a ton of other people. Go on and get that rest, because that's how I feel in that moment. The value-driven decision is, hey, I value having a six-pack because I know that gut health is tied into life expectancy, and I want to be alive to see my great-grandchildren, and I had kids late in life. So let me go on and get out this bed and do this exercise.
Yeah.
And so it's helping people be able to make that value-driven decision when their emotions invite them to make a decision based on how they feel, not based on their goals for who they want to be in the world.
Wow. Man, I feel like we need to do a whole conversation on just dieting and what Black folks need to be eating and not eating, in this white supremacy driven America. Because when you say gut health is that important, and it's a big factor in your long term health. I mean, that definitely rings a chord with me as somebody who sells life insurance and denying people all the time. Talk about your business acumen. Where did that come from? Because I see that if you're doing 55 presentations and you're traveling twice a month, I would imagine that your price is different now than it was 10 years ago. You know what I mean? I would imagine that. Talk to me just about that aspect of Dr. Crawford.
It's so interesting because, my private practice rates, those are set. I don't, because it's private practice, because I was working in an underrepresented community, I felt like that was my pro bono work because that paycheck wasn't doing much for my life. And my private practice paid for my lifestyle, but then I left that job. So I'm going to start doing a sliding scale in private practice. So those fees are what they are. But when it comes to CBRT, I use what I call an equitable rate. And that's changed. I don't know if that's a real term, equitable rate. I made it up. I might not have made it up, but I made it up to me. But basically what that means is when an organization calls me and says, hey, we want a CBRT training, I say, look, Every organization has a different budget, has a different level of investment. And the first intervention that I'm asking your organization to do is to sit down and ask, how much do we want to invest in this training? Some organizations pay as little as literally a book bag, right? That's all they had on it. There was a little middle school down the street, and they had no budget. They barely had pencils at that school. They definitely don't have hand sanitizer right now. So I'm not going to say, I'm going to charge you this high rate to have access to not being racist and biased towards brown kids. Like, what? That's God's work. Like, I got to come up for that. And then there's some organizations that are very big and have lots of money and can pay thousands of dollars per hour. And so what I ask organizations, what happens a lot of times in consulting work is an organization pays consultants different amounts of money. So you might come in and have your training and you think being paid $1,000 a month or $1,000 an hour is a lot of money. But then you look at a different consultant and they're paid $20,000. And you would have never known they're paying that. Nobody told you. You don't know these consultants. They don't know you. So I'm about rate and transparency. Sometimes the people asking me, they don't even know how much they generally pay for consultants. And diversity work is typically underpaid. So when people say we want to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but you don't even pay me half of what you would pay another consultant, my intervention is for y'all to sit down at the table and be honest about what you are paying people. And then come back to me and tell me how much you want to pay. And I would say 95% of the time, that intervention in itself keeps people righteous. There was an organization recently that I was like, I love y'all so much. Whatever you want to pay me, like if you don't even pay me, I'm just honored to come. They were working with like transgender homeless youth of color. I was like, I'll pay you to come talk to you. Like that is amazing work to do. Then they came back and was like, we have a couple $1,000s to invest in this training because it means something to us. And so I never say no. People pay me a wide range from book bags to thousands. And I've never changed that. And that equitable rate always keeps people coming back. They feel like I was honest. I never told them what they had to pay. They feel good about what they're paying. And it makes people feel like, I'm not just trying to hustle. Yes, be honest about what you can pay. But that's not what this is about for me. And so my rates have never changed. I've just always used an equitable model. I know what the industry rate is. So sometimes if someone will ask, I'll say this is the range that people pay. But that model has always worked for me. And I've been screwed over about 5% of the time. Well, I knew they could have paid more and they didn't. And I'm like, And I had one organization actually do that where they knew they could have paid more. And then they came back and told me, you know what, we could have paid you more. We want to hire you again and pay you twice as much. Wow, so that was even, I was like, y'all ain't go back and repay me though. Y'all ain't give me that reparation.
That's real. So what made you choose Howard?
I was at Bennett College. My freshman year, I was a transfer student. And I was athlete of the year there. I ran cross country, played basketball, and I ran track. And it was a Division III school. And I really felt like I was ready to be a Division I athlete. The reason I hadn't applied to Howard, honestly, was some imposter syndrome. And I had labeled it as, Howard people are bougie. I was living in Maryland, but really I was just afraid. I didn't feel like I could measure up. I felt like, is Howard right for me? Can I, some of these Black folks are generational Black college graduates. They're coming with all of these Greek organizations. They did Jack and Jill. And I'm first generation. And so I just felt scared. And so I didn't even apply to Howard as a freshman or coming out of high school. I went to Bennett. And I had a bus driver that was, his name was Jerry, that used to drive the buses for our basketball team. And he was like, you know what, Dana, I really think you should go to Howard. And I drive the track bus sometimes for the Howard coach. I'm going to give you his number. And so the coach gave me his number. I came home for the summer. And he was like, you know what, you're a good high jumper. Why don't you just come on to Howard? I had a 4.0. He's like, I'm going to give you, you'll get an academic scholarship for your tuition, and Howard will pay for your room, board, and books for track and field. Why don't you come? And so I was like, let me stop being scared. And I decided to come to Howard. I signed my acceptance to the track team like the July before I started. And I was petrified. I had that very imposter syndrome because I just didn't know. and then
So
it
what
changed
was
my
it? I
life.
mean, so okay, so you have these I guess pre-existing ideas of what it was like. What was like the compare and contrast when you actually were immersed in Howard culture and got to experience it firsthand?
Yeah, so I think of Howard similar to track. I think track is the perfect sport because track and field has something for everyone, no matter what your body type is. You can be a sprinter, you can be a thrower, you can be a jumper, you can be a hurdler. They got something for everybody. And that was the Howard experience. I was able to be, a track athlete. I was able to do poetry. I took a bowling class. I double majored in psychology and African American studies. I was involved in some levels of student government. Like Howard had something for all parts of me. I was super religious one year. It was like all up in the church. And so every component of my humanity was honored at Howard. There was no parts of me that I couldn't explore at Howard. And I know with everything in me, it made me a more well-rounded, empathetic, and just dope human because
Hmm.
of the ways that I was able to be exposed to so many different people and different parts of myself.
And so you came in. You said as a sophomore, or were you a junior?
I was a sophomore.
Okay, so you did 3 years at Howard.
Now, I went ahead and stayed at four because, the track team paid. So I got
True.
that double major, extra degree. Like, why not?
Absolutely. Okay, so you did. So when you came, what was your major? Was it African American Studies?
I came in as a bio major because I was still planning to be pre-med at the time.
Okay.
And then I changed to psychology. And then when I realized how racist psychology was, I double majored in African American studies.
Wow. Okay. So Afro Studies. So when you get to Howard, um, what organizations were you involved in on campus?
Well, how did you and I meet? um, Phi Sigma Pi. I was in poetry. Um, I was in some student government organization. I can't remember. I was in psychology club. I was in some leadership in the annex. Um, African American Studies club. Um, yeah, those are my, of
Yeah.
course, track and field.
And so okay, so when you were at Howard, you get to Howard. So Bennett, that's what in like North Carolina,
It
and
is
that's all
Greensboro.
girl, all girl.
It
Okay,
is. Yeah.
all girl. So okay, so you go from the all girl situation to Howard. Um, and you said it's much like track in that it's it's something for everybody when you get to Howard's campus. Was it when did the imposter syndrome go away, or did it stick for a while when you were there?
Yeah, I think it flared up at different points. I think the beauty of the Howard woman and the ways that women have access to fashion. And I just didn't have money. I was brokety broke, broke, broke. And so, like, seeing people wear designer clothes that I had no access to, that was hard. And I would feel like, do I fit in? I think it showed up when I would see like off-campus events and people would do like, I think there used to be like a boat party. I couldn't afford those tickets. All of the events for homecoming, couldn't afford none of that. Um, so it would show up in those ways, and I just didn't always fit because I didn't have money. Um, that was real. I think it also shows up. It showed up for me because I'm 6 feet tall. I've always been a bit awkward, I think, and so Black folks got swag. Like people are cool, and I didn't always. I felt a little geeky
You were
sometimes.
never in the fashion show?
No, I wasn't.
I'm surprised. I'm surprised you weren't in the fashion
I
show.
tried out. I ain't make it.
Oh,
I
really?
know. Hey, not a tall sister.
That's
I
crazy.
will say I had natural hair before natural hair was cool. So maybe I ain't make it because I ain't had a situation on the hair tip at the time. That movement of consciousness was happening at Howard. Or maybe I just didn't walk well. I don't know. I think I was dope, but I think being awkward sometimes. I didn't always feel like I fit in because there's so many cool people at Howard that just have like cool energy.
So many cool people that
Like
have cool
all the most
energy.
popular kids in their entire school all go to Howard, and it's like, yo,
So did that push you
yeah.
to work like extra hard when you were at Howard because you felt, I guess, maybe somewhat of a chip on your shoulder? Did you feel like you had to prove yourself?
No, I think it made me find more people that were like me. Like I just had to find my tribe. I just had to find my people. And
Hmm.
I think poetry was that space for me. You know, getting in the spoken word scene, leaning into all of the things that were like Erica Badu, and I had a clothing company at some point at Howard. I used to make my own clothes. I called it. It was called No Self Design with a K, because the more you know yourself, the more you realize there's no self, right? So I was like real thinking I was deep, right? Sewing up some clothes, selling them at the spoken word spot. So I think, I didn't have a chip. It was just like, hey, these aren't my people. Like I wasn't the coolest black kid in my school. I was at nursing school. I only went to high school 2 years. So how cool? I was always a geek. And so I just looked for people that were like me, and I found them because Howard has everybody. Everything that blackness is at Howard.
What was it like being a student athlete? Was that
Hard. It was.
challenging?
Yes. We had track practice at like 5:30 in the morning. It was insane.
Damn.
Trying to be most. I think student athletes were student athletes. They weren't interested in being part of social clubs. And it's hard to maintain that lifestyle of being a student athlete and a double major and trying to be. I was like, I started a whole organization of poetry and being a leader and the president of that group, and doing spoken word and kicking it. It was a hard system to maintain while still keeping a really good GPA.
Damn. That's real, man. You was a grown woman when we was in college doing doing real stuff. That's interesting. So, if you had to give advice to the 18-year-old Dana that was to come into Howard right now, what advice would you have for her?
It's not that serious. So it's like just you're a little too hype. I think naturally, and I think I've mellowed out with age, but I've always been more on the emotional side. Maybe that's the poet in me. But a sister used to be crying and love Jones and listening to Donnell Jones. Maybe it has to do with the fact that I went to all girls school and then I came to Howard and saw all that beautiful brothers. But a sister was like in love, in the room, ugly girl crying. And I would be like, sis, he ain't that fine. Just wait a few years. You see his Facebook a few years old later. He ain't even gonna be fine no more. So I think I would just tell myself to, not let my emotions have such a loud voice in the journey, and to just like do everything that you did, but also don't be so intense about the emotions.
And you have any regrets from your Howard experience?
Um, I don't know. I wish I would have stayed an extra year. I loved Howard. It was so
Yeah,
fun. It was so
yeah.
fun. I don't have any regrets. Well, I guess one is I wish I would have stayed in better touch with people that were not part of my core group. I think there were a lot of people in organizations that were really cool and connected with me, but even though I'm outgoing, I'm still shy, and so I wish that I would have spent more time building deeper friendships with people that I knew liked me and I liked them, but they were so cool and I was intimidated. And I just didn't keep up with those friendships on the same level. So I think that might be the only thing that I
Hmm.
would have done differently. But that's after I left Howard, not during the time there.
What's like your most memorable Howard experience?
Oh my gosh, how does one do that? Like, what? That's impossible. Like, it just depends on the moment. I could be brushing my teeth and I got a favorite moment. It's really hard. In this moment, I think it was hosting this really well attended poetry event. We called it the Wine and Cheese Social in Blackburn. And we had like 300 people come out. And it was just dope. And we had like artists come out. And it was the first time I learned how to do poetic freestyle and just like express without a written thing. And so I think just curating spaces for people to come together. Anytime I hosted events, those were my favorite moments to bring people together and amplify other artists' voices.
Yeah, I remember they used to have like the verbal Armageddon, and because we was in Phi Sig, I know that we came to it, your poetry joints, and
Yes.
that was a beauty of Phi Sig, just meeting people who you probably never would have, came in contact with. I thought that was always cool. Um, Another question I wanted to ask, well, you talked about regrets, from Howard and memorable moments. Um, so if somebody wants to get in touch with you and follow your work, that you're currently doing, how would they go about doing that?
So just Dr. Dana Crawford, in whatever format, whatever at you want to put Dr. Dana Crawford on Twitter, and that's DrDanaCrawford. So Dr. Dana Crawford at Gmail, DrDanaCrawford.com, Dr. Dana Crawford Instagram, Dr. Dana Crawford LinkedIn. Just Google that, you'll find me. And it's a lot of my work in the public domain, and it would be my honor and my privilege to engage you in a conversation about how do we access our humanity better. And that's really the heart of my work.
One question, if somebody says, why would you go to a black college? The world is not black. What would your response be to that person?
Well, my first response would be like, did you Google that before you asked me that question, right?
Right. Did you watch Josh's podcast? No.
Right. Like, you're going to have to do some work for knowledge. Knowledge is not, you don't just get knowledge on demand. So that would be my first response. And if they had Googled it, they would probably already have some theories. But my number one answer is it really helps you see the best parts of yourself walking around on a campus, and then you figure out how to incorporate those things into the world. I think every single person should have the opportunity, every single black person should have the opportunity to go to a black college and see themselves and understand themselves better. And once you understand yourself, there's nothing you can't do in this world. What? Come on now.
So 100 years from now, what are we saying about Dr. Dana Crawford?
My gosh, that's a hard question. I hope what we're saying are things like she was very compassionate. She was really invested in helping people see their best self. And I hope that they say, she was pretty cool, but damn, you see her kids? It's basic compared to them.
Thank you for joining the HU Movemaker podcast, where we highlight folks that have contributed to the Howard legacy at the highest levels. To hear more interviews or purchase merchandise, please visit www.humovemakers.com.